this was quite a shocking statement to anyone, of course, who follows Poland. But it's not really, if you look in the scope of the statements recently made by many European leaders, it's not that surprising. I mean, Germany has a big debate about this at the moment. President Macron of France has kind of offered to, widen France's nuclear umbrella to defend European nations if necessary. So there's a lot of talk of this right now because there's a lot of much more active talk about what would happen in case there was a real military threat to Europe at the moment. But I think it's a sign of the times. I mean, we will see much more talk of those kinds of things in the weeks to come as Europe ramps up its defense production, and European leaders, and of course Starmer as well, make the point quite clearly that this is necessary in light of the situation in the world today.
Speaking on a trip to Canada, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy has said it would be wrong for Putin to place any conditions on a ceasefire. Well, joining us now is Matthew Luxmoore, who is foreign correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. Matthew, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
What do you know about the meeting between Witkoff and Putin? What kind of readout have you had?
Well, we know very little because it was behind closed doors. There was no press conference. The Russian side are playing their cards very close to their chest. The Kremlin said today that the meeting had taken place, a very brief one. But Witkoff is obviously not on Putin's level in terms of his official status. Putin is angling for a meeting with President Trump so that he can hash out this Ukraine crisis, as he calls it. So I think with Witkoff, he sees him really just as a messenger who can deliver a message to Trump.
And Putin says that he still has serious questions about this proposal. What are his top questions or concerns?
Well, Putin, of course, said yesterday in his typical style that he accepts the ceasefire proposal, but first, around 10 different very complex issues have to be ironed out. So, of course, he couldn't come across saying that he rejects a ceasefire, that he rejects essentially an end to the fighting and the killing. But at the same time, it really amounts to a rejection of any immediate ceasefire. He says that peace, there has to be some kind of enforcement mechanism. It's not clear who's going to enforce the front line. It's not going to be clear what happens to the Ukrainian soldiers that are still fighting on Russian territory, who Russia's trying to oust right now. It's not clear what's going to happen to the troops that Russia accuses of committing war crimes. So Putin's really, I think, kicking the can down the road in many ways, and definitely he's very far from agreeing to any ceasefire at this stage.
Yeah, absolutely. It feels like, as you say, it's a sort of tactic, isn't it? Yeah, yes, of course I'll agree to this, but. And he also has talked about, the tackling the sort of root causes. He says that a ceasefire will depend on removing the root causes of the war. But when we look back at what those root causes were, just remind us what they were. I mean, I remember this phrase, he wanted to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. What did he mean by that then? And do you think that's a language he'd use again now?
Well, I think to answer your question more broadly, it's good for your listeners to know that Putin really envisions a kind of grand bargain that includes not just Ukraine, but ultimately and ideally a reorganization of Eastern Europe, a pushback of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to its borders of 1993 out of Eastern Europe. And he really has nothing to lose in pressing these maximalist demands right now. The Russian military is pushing forward on the battlefield in many different parts of the 600-mile front line. Putin is starting off with this maximalist position. But as far as this concerns Ukraine and what he wants in Ukraine, what he calls a denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine, is to kind of create this neutral and neutered Ukrainian state without an ability to defend itself and unaligned with any military blocs, that is also heavily influenced by Russian influence and brings back Russian culture and the Russian language to the level that it was before 2014 when this war really started.
And look, the Kremlin has, had denied a report that Trump's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, Keith Kellogg, was excluded from talks at Moscow's request. What do you make of that?
Well, these are reports that we heard quite a few weeks ago now. Of course, Kellogg has played a very small role in negotiations. He hasn't negotiated directly with the Russians. He has made a trip to Kiev to speak with Zelensky. I can't confirm the report myself, but we did hear rumblings about this several weeks ago because it was quite clear that Kellogg had been sidelined. And some reports said he was sidelined by the US side because he wasn't. He was too, allegedly pro-Ukrainian. But I can't confirm the reports. We don't have that in our own reporting. I think we'll have to wait to see what role, if any, he'll play.
One of our listeners has just messaged in, Matthew, and made the point. I think you'll find that Gorbachev went along with German unification as long as there was no NATO advance. Breach of this is what Putin is referring to as a root cause, I suspect. What would you say to my listener's thought?
I mean, Putin has complained on numerous occasions over almost the past 2 decades about NATO expansion. This is almost the most common refrain with Putin. This is one of the main reasons he gave for launching his invasion in 2022. He's made numerous statements since that suggest this is a war of conquest aimed at taking over Ukraine. So it seems like the NATO expansion was just one of the reasons that he gave. But he cites this alleged promise made to Gorbachev, which we don't have recording of, or it is simply what we know from contemporaneous accounts by people who claim to have been in the room. So various Russian officials have said over the years that there was a promise made not to expand NATO. But I mean, more broadly and more to the point, it doesn't matter so much what the promise was. It matters more that for Putin, the expansion of NATO was simply unacceptable. And he wants to, and I think this is very unlikely to happen, he wants to row back NATO to its 1993 size, which I think, would go far beyond Ukraine in terms of negotiation.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as you say, that's way bigger than Ukraine, and it's really interesting that you've raised that, and it's really important for us to have that at the back of our mind. And final question to you, Matthew: the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is hosting a video call with European leaders, this sort of coalition of the willing, if you like. What's your take on what's happening with this coalition of the willing? And certainly, you're outside the UK. You're obviously reporting for the Wall Street Journal. How do you think Keir Starmer, what do you think his position is in all of this?
I think he's playing a very active part in trying to kind of consolidate European solidarity and support behind Ukraine, which for the Ukrainians is absolutely crucial in the event that the US withdraws permanently, or at least for a prolonged period of time, the crucial military aid that has been given to Ukraine. It's very unclear whether the Europeans could actually give enough military support to Ukraine for Ukraine to continue its resistance to the Russian onslaught. Definitely many of the weapons that that the Americans are able to provide cannot be replaced by the Europeans, especially air defenses, which are crucial to defending Ukraine's cities. But of course, Starmer and Macron, they're playing a very crucial role in trying to kind of consolidate or create this program of making Europe into the kind of core of Ukraine's defense. So I think it's, of course, a very promising thing, and we'll just have to wait to see whether they can patch up relations with the Americans and whether Trump is willing to continue giving support to Ukraine.
And sorry, I did say final question, but just one other thought that's come into our head. Just talk to us a bit about Poland, because Poland's is interesting. President Duda's revealed that he's been discussing the potential locating of American tactical nukes in Poland. I mean, surely that would be a huge provocation to Russia. What's going on with Poland at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is quite a... we have to bear in mind that, Poland has elections coming up, but also this was quite a shocking statement to anyone, of course, who follows Poland. But it's not really, if you look in the scope of the statements recently made by many European leaders, it's not that surprising. I mean, Germany has a big debate about this at the moment. President Macron of France has kind of offered to, widen France's nuclear umbrella to defend European nations if necessary. So there's a lot of talk of this right now because there's a lot of much more active talk about what would happen in case there was a real military threat to Europe at the moment. But I think it's a sign of the times. I mean, we will see much more talk of those kinds of things in the weeks to come as Europe ramps up its defense production, and European leaders, and of course Starmer as well, make the point quite clearly that this is necessary in light of the situation in the world today. So I see those statements from Duda really in that light.
Well, look, Matthew, really good to talk to you. Thanks very much for your time. That's Matthew Luxmoore, who's foreign correspondent at the Wall Street Journal.